Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
We will today talk about we talked about realism, and now let us briefly take a look at what all metaethics theories that we have talked about. Now, if you look at the screen, I have made three classification of metaethics, which I have managed to scribble in the little space that I left for myself in red. So, these are basically three kinds of metaethical foundations. Now, the first one is we have talked about definist theories. They are naturalistic or metaphysical. What are their criteria? Well, ought can be explained or can be understood in terms of is. Values may be inferred from facts. And ethical terms can be understood in terms of non-ethical terms. So, briefly, definist theories are naturalistic and metaphysical. The ought can be understood in terms of is, values may be inferred from facts, ethical terms can be understood in terms of non-ethical terms. Now, let us simplistically try to understand what do we mean by this. Well, when I say definist theories, this is a whole school of theories belonging to metaethics, and which talks about what is the foundation of the ethical quest. Now, definist theories by the term used refers to definition. So, to explain or to define a value term, we can take the help of a factual term. Put even more simplistically, when we talked about hedonism or utilitarianism, to define good or to understand good or right or any such ethical term, we refer to a non-ethical, factual, empirically available concept like pleasure, like happiness. So, these are psychological facts, these are psychological states. So, whenever we are trying to understand the ethical domain in terms of factual domain, we are having an implicit assumption of definist metaethics. It is naturalistic or also known as metaphysical metaethics. Now, metaphysical because even say suppose we say concurrence to a religious word or a religious book or a religious claim or a religious leader can also be understood in terms of definist theory, because there the religious book is defining that this is the right thing to do because it is the word of God or it is the word of their leader. So, the justification is again coming from something factual or empirical. Now, what further does this theory assume? This assumes that values may be inferred from facts. You remember, we sensitized ourselves or we explored the domain of values and facts and how are they connected with each other. Now, the naturalistic theories that we earlier talked about claim that they can understand values in terms of facts, that they can understand right action in terms of what, for example, in terms of what brings about the greatest happiness of the greatest number. This is an example of a naturalistic ethics, but it is not confined to naturalistic ethics. Utilitarianism or hedonism is a kind of naturalistic ethics, but there are other kinds of it also. So, to understand or to define value terms, we need factual terms. But let us look at an example where perhaps why many places where the naturalistic ethicist is critiqued. Now, let us assume that well, you are standing on a road and a car is or a vehicle is speedily coming onto you. Now, these are the facts of the case, that you are standing on a road, a vehicle is speedily coming onto you, and if you do not do anything, it is most likely that it will hit you. These are facts, but from where in these facts do we get the claim that well, I should move out of, I should pay attention on the word, I should move out of the path of the vehicle, I ought to give way, or I ought to jump out of the way of the vehicle. Now, this is where various critiques have critiqued naturalism, that well, naturalism understandably gives a domain of facts, but from the facts how is a prescription or how is a value or how is a motivation arrived at. Now, given that this is the state of affairs, that well, a vehicle is rushing on to you, I ought to jump out of its way. So, this ought, this motivational should claim is a claim that comes from the agent. It is not a part of the description of the scene, that once the agent or the person has jumped out of the path of the vehicle, that becomes a part of the description of the agent. So, what is prescription if followed becomes description, but prescription is not a part of description. A prescription executed becomes a part of description, but a prescription by itself is not a part of description. So, this is where the critiques of naturalism argue that well, naturalism as a metaethical foundation does not actually give us any norms what to do, it only describes the way things are, and that is insufficient to arrive at norm. Now, if you look at this screen, what we have basically talked out is summed up over here, that well, values may be inferred from facts. Now, non-naturalistic theories would critique that, and that ethical terms can be understood in terms of non-ethical terms. Now, this is what the naturalistic ethicists would have us to believe, but as we see that there are many gaping loopholes in this theory of naturalism, but of course, the truth to be arrived at is a vigorous journeying between theories and their counter claims and counterclaims and in their synthesis. So, this is definitely that there is no one theory that is completely immune to any criticism, but to be aware of a criticism is to be refine the theory. So, we will leave naturalism at the moment right here, and then we will move on to what is the second classification, the second kind of metaethics, which is as we see intuitionism or non-naturalistic theories. Let me number them. Now, the intuitionism or non-naturalistic theories can be they give up on natural theories and psychological arguments. Their basic principles and value judgments are intuitive or self-evident. So, well, where they differ from the definite theories is that values cannot be inferred from facts. Ethical terms cannot be understood in terms of non-ethical terms. So, what they are crucially saying is that well, ethical properties stand for the properties of things. So, in essence, their claim comes out to be that, well, ethical notions are self-evident notions. Just as yellowness, pleasantness, or any other fundamental question. Okay. Now, let us explore what do we mean by these non-naturalistic theories. Intuitionism is one of them. Intuitionism or non-naturalistic theories. Now, well, non-naturalistic theories, they are different from definistic theories, because they are not proposing to define ethical terms in terms of non-ethical terms. In fact, on the other hand, they are contrary to definist theories by claiming that ethical terms cannot be understood in terms of non-ethical terms. So, good is something fundamental. In the history of Western philosophy, there was a philosopher called G. E. Moore, whom we have talked about in a brief manner, and the open question argument, in which the philosopher tried to show that, well, the term good or the concept good is in principle indefinable, but yet nevertheless it is not meaningless. Now, to define something is to reduce it into simpler parts, to more fundamental blocks. So, when I try to define any complex notion or any notion, I will try to explain it in terms of simpler parts. Now, there is a problem with definition. There is a problem with definition, because definition assumes that there are simpler blocks to it. There are simpler components to the term which is intended to be defined. So, definition is assuming that, well, what is wanted or what is going to be defined is a complex object and can be reduced to smaller or more fundamental blocks. Now, the second metaethics school, or not school exactly, but the bunch of theories that we talk about, intuitionism or non-naturalistic theories, do not subscribe to this. They have a claim that ethical terms are fundamental, they are self-evident. Now, what does this mean? Let us slow down. Let us say, if you want to define something as color, or something as say our 5 fundamental sense perceptions that we have: taste, smell, touch. Now, these are fundamental to us and cannot be further simplified for us. We might be able to tell the biochemistry, the physics behind the sensory process that takes place, but for one to perceive a color, there can be perhaps nothing more fundamental or defining than the very fact that one perceives color, and that is the understanding of color. It cannot be defined into more simpler terms. Now, these philosophers, the non-naturalistic philosophers, intuitionists, claim to give this kind of a position to the ethical terms, that ethical terms need not be defined, rather not need not, but cannot be defined in terms of non-ethical terms, because they are by themselves unanalyzably simple. So, what they are basically is unanalyzable and simple. So, this is what is meant by self-evident. Now, when some terms are are simple and unanalyzable, they cannot be further explained, defined or understood in terms of other notions, and therefore, they are final. So, many of us might have a feeling that, well, all this talk of understanding ethics, what is it to understand anything? It is to break it into simpler notions or parts that we are familiar with. So, if we are familiar with say we talk about say a triangle. A triangle, we try to understand it in terms of lines and angles, which is presumably more fundamental to triangle, because lines and angles come together, dots and points come together to form a triangle. But this assumes that, well, triangle is a complex entity and can be defined in terms of simpler entities. So, there are simpler entities in terms of which it can be defined. But now, when I say define the color yellow, what would you define it as? Well, many of us would perhaps say that, well, it is defined by the wavelength or the frequency of the light that produces the sensation of yellowness in us. But the sensation of yellowness, is it the same thing as the frequency or the wavelength, which is a measure, but it is not the notion of yellowness. The notion of yellowness or the notion of taste is something that we fundamentally have. That is a part of how we encounter, approach the world. That is our framework of making sense of the world. Same thing like sweetness. Things may be more sweet, less sweet, but what is it to be sweet depends on the agent, right. That I know what is sweet and it cannot be further broken down into any simplers. It is a simple notion, or it is a simple, as one would say. Now, ethical terms, the intuitionists and the non-naturalists claim that have this kind of a self-evidence, that is, they are no more reducible, analyzable, understandable in terms of non-ethical terms. They are simples. So, the right action and the good action or the good of an agent is a simple. It is to be known by the agent itself. We will talk about this next when we finish the classification of these three theories. We will talk about intuitionism. Now, if you come to the slide, the third theory that we talk about is the non-descriptivist theory. So, this claims that, well, ethical judgments are not assertions or statements. Ascribing or denying properties to actions, persons or things. So, in a way these are the non-descriptivists can claim that these are non-justifiable opinions, if we may say. Example would be emotivism that we have talked about. So, now what do the non-descriptivists on the other hand say? Well, the non-descriptivists are of the opinion that, well, as a metaethical foundation, that ethical terms do not describe anything. They are perhaps exhortations to action, they are expressions of feelings, but they are not statements. That is, they are not in the domain of truth and falsity. In philosophy, as particularly in logic, when we talk about statements or propositions, more accurately propositions is a claim made in a sentence and has which can have the value of either true or false. So, a question is not a proposition. Many sentences can contain the same proposition. So, non-descriptivists are of the opinion that, well, there is ethical claims are not propositions. Now, we will talk about non-descriptivists in a few moments to come, but before that let us talk about the topic we choose to talk about today is intuitionism. Before we talk about intuitionism, let us take a look at what let us remind ourselves of the fundamental classification between consequentialism and deontology. So, the classifications were, well, consequentialism, it depends on the right action is determined by the good consequences to be brought about. Deontology, on the other hand, claims that, well, the right action is independent of the consequences that it brings about. So, basically the question that they are asking is that these two theories are answers to the same question, only different answers to the same question. The question being that how is the right related to the good. Now, if consequentialists would answer that, well, the right is wholly determined by the good, or is wholly determined by the good, whereas the the deontologists would say that, well, or the right is independent of the good. Now, this is basically we worked out or brought back the classification between consequentialism and deontology. Now, intuitionism is a form of deontology. Is a form of deontological ethics. Now, let us just explore that. Well, we have talked about deontological ethics before, and what does intuitionism say about that? Well, the intuition comes from the word intuitionism naturally evidently comes from the word intuition, which perhaps most of us would understand as almost some mysterious way of knowing, of intuiting, or some even if we do not term it mysterious, but as something which is scientifically undemonstrable way of knowing what is intuitionism, or what is the solution to it. Now, unfortunately, there are a lot of misconceptions about intuitionism that make it seem to be much more mysterious than what it actually is. So, let us just have a brief talk about intuitionism, what is meant by intuitionism. Now, the intuitionists are a part of the non-naturalistic claim, which non-naturalistic metaethics, which claim that, well, moral terms or ethical terms are self-evident. Now, what do they mean when they say that it is self-evident? Is it that by some mysterious way we come to know whether this is the right thing to do or that is not the right thing to do, or how do we decide on an action? We come to know by intuition, and in a way then there is no theorizing at all. It is just a matter of your intuition, what perhaps the emotivists called feeling, the intuitionists called intuition. This is incorrect. Intuitionists are need or deserve a little more attention that perhaps the history of philosophy has given to them. Now, the intuitionists make a claim that moral facts are self-evident. They are self-evident in a way that we do not arrive at it from an algorithm. So, let's put it down. Let's say ethical terms cannot be understood in terms of non-ethical terms. Ethical terms are, or ethical notions, are self-evident. Now, this is a portion that we would require certain clarification before we can truly evaluate or assess the meaning of self-evidence in terms of ethical notions. So, ethical terms cannot be understood in terms of non-ethical terms. Ethical notions are self-evident, and what we would like to say is that, well, it is still a matter of theorizing. Now, the preliminary instance, let me say, why do I make this claim that is intuitionism a matter of moral theorizing? Now, if you take a let's imagine if intuitionism is claiming that, well, moral truths are self-evident, that they are not algorithmic, that if you take a look at this slide, that, well, moral reasoning is not blind, dead algorithms. Now, when I say that, well, moral notions are not blind, dead algorithms, perhaps I can best explain it first as an example in terms of two very notions essential to law. Well, let us postulate, let me put forth a question to you. Can we imagine something called, and let's term it an AJM, right, on the lines of ATM, which is an automatic judging machine to be used in law courts, in place of judges. Now, this is the thought experiment that I would like you to focus on, that let's look at the screen and say that, well, the automatic judging machine, or AJM, is to be used in law courts in place of judges. Now, is that feasible? Now, think over it. Now, would you find this to be feasible? Let us say India has a whole battery of law cases pending, and there is tremendous of pressure on the legal system, there is insufficient manpower, and it takes a lot of time, and court cases prolong. So, we would like it to be shortened, we would like it to be more efficient. Let us design, let us ask the engineers to design this AJM, an automatic judging machine. Now, this automatic judging machine will be a very Of course, a very powerful computer which will know all the law cases that are that have taken place, will be familiar with all the relevant codes of the constitution, of the legal acts to be abided by, will also be will have an excellent memory of precedences and all such claims. Now, do these can we ask, can the law minister or the law ministry ask the engineers to build such a machine, or would he be making a fool of himself, or would he not even dare to ask such a question, or is this a wrong question? That is what most of us would think, that of course, it is a wrong question. I mean, how can you have an automatic judging machine or an automatic telling machine? We can understand somebody that this is something that is a machine that dispenses money, some machine that does a lot of calculations, some that even human beings cannot do, and so on and so forth. But having an automatic judging machine, what does that mean? Well, let me explain. As we keep talking, we will come to know the perspective of the intuitionists. Well, why do we think there cannot be an automatic judging machine? If at all we think so, and probably many of you would be thinking that there cannot be an automatic judging machine to replace the wise old judge with the wig on, that there is something about a judge's job that cannot be seen in terms of algorithms, because when we are proposing an automatic judging machine, what are we saying? We are trying to understand that what does a bank teller do? A bank teller does something which is, to put simplistically, which can be made algorithmic or mechanical. That you present a check, she sees what is the balance in your account, verifies whether this account is yours by tallying the signature, makes a deduction in the account, gives you that relevant money. Now, this was what the teller did, one of the many things that the teller did. Now, engineers could design a machine that could do the same thing. Now, it identifies you with your ATM card and the PIN that you enter. It has direct access to your bank balance. So, it verifies that you have the same bank balance, and accordingly it error proofly counts the notes and dispatches it or releases it in the ATM counter. Now, this is what happened when the teller became automated. So, there was no more a person to do that job. Now, can the judge's job be automated in such a manner? It would be countless benefits for it to happen. If many of you, or if you are one of them who are not comfortable with such an idea, or who would further say that such a thing is not possible, then you are coming close to the intuitionist's claim. Now, let us imagine what does take a look at what does happen in a court case. Well, the first thing we start with is evidence. Then there is arguments, postulations, testimonies, feasibility, let us assume this all against reasoning or argumentation to finally have the verdict. Now, simplistically put, this is the basic format of what happens in a court case, right. How does one arrive from the evidence to the verdict? Now, evidence is something which we can perhaps equate with natural facts. They are empirical, they ought to be demonstrable, or they ought to be provable, that, and it is something that perhaps even a machine or an algorithm can detect. Now, from these facts, how do you make a judgment? Now, if we can arrive from natural, is this a process of, is this an algorithm? The intuitionist's answer no, that this is not an algorithm, and because it is not an algorithm, so we always need the human element here. So, how to assess and evaluate? How to assess and evaluate the evidence to reach the verdict? Now, this is a philosopher called Lake, Patton Lake. Philip Stratton, sorry, the philosopher called Philip Stratton Lake is credited with giving this analogy of between evidence and verdict. Now, having known the evidence, can we reach a verdict? We do reach a verdict, but can a machine reach a verdict? So, when the intuitionists say that, well, certain moral fact or moral claims or moral concepts are self evident and cannot be explained in terms of non ethical terms or factual terms or empirical terms or what surrounds us all, then we are making a case of self evidence, a case of judgment from self evidence. Now, how does the judge make this case at all? How does the judge bring forth a verdict at all? Is it out of a concoction? It is how does the judge concoct a verdict, if at all he does it or she does it? Now, this is where the intuitionists come in. Their claim is that, well, a verdict is not cannot be algorithmically related to the evidence, and there is where the human element, the what critics have criticized as the mysterious element in arriving at the assessment, the weightage given to which evidence is required to arrive at judgment. So, it is perhaps to put it in a jocular vein, the final bastion, human bastion that resists mechanization. Of course, that would be a cliched way of putting the notion, but well, in essence the intuitionists are of this claim that, well, when we talk about self evidence, it is not about any magical mysterious self evidence, but because moral terms are so simple and unanalyzably and thereof human, that, well, we require a human being to judge, not possibly a machine, because a machine represents algorithm, and if this cannot be put in the terms of an algorithm, we cannot judge the same. So, when intuitionists are making a claim that it is self evidence, what they mean is that, well, no matter how the evidence is presented, to assess the evidence, we have to have the human agency is intervention to arrive at what is self evidence notion of truth, moral truth, and thereof make a judgment. So, this is simplistically put what is meant by the self evidence term used by intuitionists. Now, let us we've earlier talked about a philosopher called W. D. Ross. Now, W. D. Ross was an example of intuition of an intuitionist. Well, Ross put forth in our earlier talks when we talked about moral theories, not metaethics, we talked about Ross philosophy, and we can go back to the earlier lectures to talk about this. This was the philosopher that we talked about, and he talked about something called the prima facie duties. So, let me just briefly tell you in 2 sentences about what Ross' claim was. That Ross is a non-naturalistic intuitionist philosopher. So, Ross' claim is that, well, there are certain set of, any situation presents a certain set of prima facie duties, duties of non-malevolence, duties of reparation. So, he puts out a list of 6 to 7 duties, which are prima facie duties. But what makes these prima facie duties actual duties is the human element. Now, that there are various kinds of duties which are fundamental, but well, sometimes say it is a duty to be where is the moral dilemma? The moral dilemma comes when there is a conflict between 2 duties or 2 or more duties. So, when I say that, well, I would like to be non-violent and I would like to be truthful, but I see that, well, there are numerous imaginable cases where I would have to sacrifice one to hold on to the other. So, and in which situation can I sacrifice one and hold on to the other? So, Ross puts forth these sets of duties, but again puts the final ball in the human agent's court, that depending on the circumstances, the agent in concern has to make a question and evaluate and assess the various factors around the decision, around the moral dilemma, to take a final call. So, sometimes I would say the conflict that we talked about between being honest and being non-violent. Now, sometimes if I have to be let us imagine the classic Platonic case, that, well, a friend has loaned you a firearm and has gone on a voyage, comes back insane, but because you are an honest person, you would like to return what was given to you for safekeeping, but you are also a non-violent person, or you want to propagate non-violence. So, you know that this friend of yours who went for the voyage is now insane and would perhaps take the weapon and cause harm to others or to himself. Now, here you clearly have a contradiction between 2 duties. So, you would have to decide. So, that is why Ross leaves that decision, that, well, the standard deontologist tries to work out a dead blind algorithm to give a solution to every moral dilemma. The intuitionist, on the other hand, leaves that much of space, because of the claim of the intuitionist that, well, this final space cannot be algorithmized and it needs a human agent to observe the evidence, the situation that the moral dilemma presents, and then take the decision. There cannot be a moral calculator or a moral positioning system in lines of the global positioning system to give a mechanical answer to the question. So, that is a question that the agent has to think over, assess for himself or herself, and decide, and that is where, that is perhaps the case how most of us go through life. So, that makes a case for self evidence of the final step of moral decision making. So, simplistically put, intuitionism is not as mysterious as we believe it to be, or as it is reputed to be. So, we try to bring about a balance between an algorithmic assessment of the situation and a final moral claim that is to come from the human agent, from assessing the weightages. That is the self evident or the irreducible part of the decision making procedure.